All right. In prior discussions, we've talked about kind of two broad categories or types of approaches to determining the market value of equity. One of those I will loosely group in as the discounted value approach, and so that would include the discounted cash flows, discounted dividends, discounted earnings, the comparables or multiples type approaches. The other view is the option view, where we talked about equity as a call option on the future value of the firm's assets. Um, if you'll recall, um, those two views had some conflicts or apparent conflicts, and so the purpose of this video is to discuss how you might reconcile those views. So before we jump into that, a couple of key assumptions, just so that I make sure the terminology is clear. First, let's define risk. Risk is the potential for loss due to future uncertainty. Financial risk is the potential for a financial loss due to some future uncertainty. And so when we think about that, what I want you to think in terms of is that you may have this distribution of possible future outcomes. Now, not all of those future outcomes will result in loss. So, risk is not the entire distribution of uncertainty, it's only the likelihood and amount of loss that you could incur. So, it's only that sort of left tail, if you will, of the distribution of all the things that could happen in the future. It is widely accepted in financial theory that the investors' required return, which we inside the company would think of as our discount rate on equity or on debt, whatever. But the investor's required return on an investment increases as its risk increases, all other things remaining the same. And so, again, very consistently, we would look and say, look, if you increased the likelihood of loss without giving me anything in return for that, then I'm not going to like your investment as much. I'm not going to be willing to pay as much for it, and therefore you'll have to give me a much better sort of expected or required return on the investment in order to make it worth my while. I'm sorry, should say that we will talk more about all of this sort of relationship between risk and return in a future discussion. Right now, I know that this is putting the cart before the horse a little bit, but I hate to leave this issue outstanding. So, what's the dilemma? Given the assumption that an increase in risk will increase the discount rate on an investment, then the discounted value views all predict that increasing risk will result in a decrease in the value to equity owners, and so the value of their equity. Now, the option-based view of the value of equity predicts that increases in risk will result in an increase in value to equity owners. So we've got these two, what appear to be conflicting views. Discounted value view says if you increase risk, the value of your stocks will go down. Option-based view says if you increase risk, the value of your stocks will go up. And the question is, how do we reconcile these two views? Or can you? Are they just so completely different that you can't reconcile them? So, in order to really get at this, we have to dig into the details, just a little bit of each of them. So let's think about the option-based view. To be clear, while it does have some predictions about risk, it really focuses on uncertainty, not just risk. And so it focuses on the entire distribution of possible outcomes. And the prediction isn't that the value goes up when risk goes up. The prediction is that the value goes up when uncertainty goes up. And so, key thing is that the option-based view assumes that the increase in the uncertainty of future asset values are symmetrical. So that while you're increasing the downside risk, you're also increasing the potential for upside benefit. It also, if you recall, reflects the fact that the downside risk wouldn't increase in the same way as the upside benefit. Remember, downside risk being the downside potential for loss, because you as an equity investor have a limited liability position in the company. And so at some point, even as that downside gets wider, it's not that you're going to start getting negative results in that downside. You're simply going to walk away with nothing. And so while the upside continues to extend out and be, getting more and more positive, the downside just increases the probability of getting zero. It doesn't create any probability of you getting a negative value. And so as a result, the downside measure of risk doesn't increase in the same way as the potential upside benefit. And so the option-based view predicts that the increase in value of the equity comes because you're increasing the potential upside benefit by more than you're increasing the downside risk. And so you're giving more benefit for the risk that you're taking. And that's really what's baked in that assumption. Now let's look at the discounted value type approaches and what they view. They do reflect increased risk by an increased discount rate. And so there's not a place in that model to put in risk, any of those models. You just recognize that when you increase risk, so the potential for loss, that you're going to increase the discount rate. However, the discounted value view does not explicitly assume that the firm gets any benefit from taking on the risk. So if you don't put any benefit into the model, then it won't put any in for you. And so, if you thought about it, if we went back to sort of the assumptions under the option view, it would probably say that if you took on more risk, if you took on more uncertainty and your risk came because you were taking on sort of a symmetrical change in uncertainty, so upside and downside were kind of growing at the same rate, that it would expect that your cash flows would improve. The expected value of the cash flows to equity in particular, because again, there's still that limited liability feature. And so it predicts, because it doesn't explicitly put that improvement in there, it predicts that an increase in the equity value would happen if the firm takes on more risk without gaining any additional upside benefit for taking on the risk. And that makes sense. So what we're really talking about here is whether or not there's any benefit that comes with this risk. In fact, the discounted value view would predict an increase in equity value if you adjusted the numerator to show that there was an increase in the upside benefit, or the potential for upside benefit, that was greater than the increase in the potential downside risk, or the downside risk. So you could adjust the discounted value view and the options view to be somewhat more consistent, just by making sure that you take both the risk and the reward into consideration. So what are the insights from this? What I want you to take away from this? If the firm takes on more downside risk without receiving any additional upside benefit, and so imagine, again, using sort of our distribution picture, imagine that the left tail gets a lot more negative, and so there's a greater probability of us defaulting, but the right tail doesn't grow out to the right anymore. It just sits the same place, right? If that were to happen, then the option-based view would have also predicted a decline in equity value. There's just not a straightforward way in the Black-Scholes model to do that, but if we're using decision trees and you did that, you would also see that the equity value would decline. If firms were to receive more upside benefit than downside risk that it takes on, and that were reflected in the numerator of the discounted value approaches, then they would predict an increase in equity value when uncertainty and downside risk increased. And so that would be consistent with the option-based view. And so the bottom line is that as long as you, in both models, you're properly reflecting what this trade-off between the upside benefit and the downside risk are, then both models would give you a consistent result. And in fact, just so that you guys don't walk away from this saying, what the heck, the good news is that market behavior is consistent with these views. We do see that stock prices increase when firms take on more risk if they have a story for how the risk is justified because they are doing things that have substantial potential for benefit. We also see that firms that take on the risk without adding any benefit, that their equity values drop. And both models would have predicted that. So what does that mean for us? Remember that this is a corporate finance class. So we're not in this talking about the investor side. We're in it talking about what you as managers of the firm would take away from all of these theories in terms of making decisions about the firm. So the key insights, number one, good managers don't take on additional downside risk for no reason. Usually there are opportunities, and the risk is associated with taking on new opportunities. And it just seems to be the case in the world that some of the opportunities that have the greatest potential for upside benefit also include some significant downside risk. That's just the nature of the world. Now, it doesn't have to always be that way. And if you certainly find something that's got great upside benefit without downside risk, significant increase in downside risk, you should take that. Always, always, always. It's just that a lot of times you won't find that. Now, the other thing that often gets overlooked, and what a lot of people sort of walk out of this basically saying is, well, based on all of this, what I really should be doing is minimizing my risk. My goal as management should be to minimize the risk. Remember that minimizing risk also potentially means passing up on opportunities with great potential for upside benefit. And so the goal of management should not necessarily be to minimize risk, but rather to maximize the benefits, the potential upside benefits from taking on any level of risk. So you should always require that the upside benefits exceed a downside risk before you take it on. And if there are opportunities to either improve the upside or reduce the downside while keeping the upside the same, then you should do that. So really the goal isn't to minimize risk. It is to maximize the value from the amount of risk that you're taking on. I hope that you guys find this useful. I just hated to kind of leave you hanging with this dilemma and not give you a little bit of insight from my perspective in how that gets resolved. Thank you.